"Sir, you're in the wrong section." The words cut through the air like a blade. Every eye in the first-class cabin turned toward Caleb Morgan, the only black man in the front rows. His ticket paid in full shook slightly in his hand as the lead attendant's smile froze into something colder. "Not for someone like you," she added, her voice dripping with certainty. The silence that followed was deafening heavy with judgment. What she didn't know, what no one there knew, was that Caleb wasn't just another passenger. He was the airline's largest shareholder, and the decision to humiliate him today would cost them more than any ticket ever could. If this story touches you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so together we can keep these stories alive. The boarding gate at Dallas-Fort Worth buzzed with the familiar chaos of a late afternoon departure. Families shuffled bags. Business travelers tapped on phones, and flight attendants at gate C-17 worked their way through the line of passengers boarding Sky-High Airways Flight 482 bound for New York. At the very front of the line, Caleb Morgan adjusted his jacket and pulled his boarding pass from the inside pocket. The bold black letters clearly read, "Sat 2B First Class for Caleb, 55 years old." These flights were routine. Years of building Helios Technologies from a two-room startup into a multi-billion-dollar leader in ethical AI had turned him into a man who practically lived in airports. But no matter how many flights he took, he never forgot what his father once told him. "Never let them take your dignity, son. Not for a seat, not for a job, not for anything." His father had been a bus mechanic in Atlanta, a man who lost his job after refusing to stay silent about unsafe conditions. Caleb carried that memory like a compass, always reminding him why he built technology to expose hidden bias, why he pushed harder than others, why he always walked tall. As he stepped through the first-class doorway, the scent of leather seats and coffee filled the cabin. He nodded politely to a young attendant at the galley and moved toward row 2. His seat 2B was waiting for him. Window view, enough leg room to stretch a small luxury he had earned many times over. But before he could place his bag in the overhead, a voice sliced through the calm. "Excuse me, sir." A woman's voice rang clipped and sharp. "I believe you're in the wrong section." Caleb turned. Standing a few feet away was Linda Hargrave, the flight's lead attendant, mid-50s. Her uniform pressed to perfection hair, styled in an elegant bob and a pearl pin, fastened neatly at her collar. Her expression wasn't confusion. It was certainty. Certainty that he didn't belong. Caleb raised his boarding pass gently, his tone calm. "Seat 2B. That's mine." Linda's eyes flicked to the pass but didn't soften. "That seat is reserved for our platinum frequent flyers, not for someone like you." The words hit like ice water. Passengers in the first row paused mid-conversation, eyes drifting toward the confrontation. Caleb felt every gaze, the familiar weight pressing down. For a moment, he didn't answer. He simply inhaled steady, and remembered all the times he had trained himself to stay composed. He thought of his younger years coding in a cramped apartment with peeling paint. Nights spent eating boxed noodles while chasing a dream no one believed in. He thought of his mother telling him, "You can't stop people from judging you, but you can stop them from breaking you." Caleb straightened. "This is my ticket." He repeated, sliding it closer so the gold seat number shone under the cabin light. "I checked in properly, just like everyone else." Linda's lips pressed into a thin smile that carried no warmth. "Well, sometimes we need to make accommodations for very important guests. You'll need to move back to business class. We'll still provide you a meal." From the corner of his eye, Caleb noticed a young woman a few rows back, dark hair pulled into a messy bun, a press badge clipped to her backpack. She had paused mid-sip of coffee, her phone angled discreetly in her hand. Nana Alvarez, though Caleb didn't know her name, yet had the instincts of a journalist. She knew something bigger was brewing. Caleb leaned back, slightly resting his hands on the armrests of seat 2B. His voice dropped lower, calmer, carrying the weight of patience earned over decades. With respect, "Ma'am, I am exactly where I'm supposed to be." Linda's eyes narrowed around them. Whispers began to spread. A businessman in 3A lowered his newspaper. A mother in 4C shifted uncomfortably. The cabin had turned into a stage, and Caleb unwillingly its center. Linda glanced toward the curtain dividing first class from the galley. A shadow stirred there. Shaw Doyle, the cabin supervisor, tall, broad-shouldered his uniform, crisp, his jaw set, as though he had rehearsed this posture of authority for years. He stepped forward slowly, his tone practiced low enough to sound discreet, but loud enough for nearby passengers to catch. "Sir, let's not escalate this. Why don't you just gather your things and move back quietly? We'll sort it out later." The request wasn't about order. It was about a razor, about moving Caleb out of sight, out of the seat he had rightfully earned. Caleb exhaled through his nose, steady, unwavering. He wasn't just thinking about himself anymore. He was thinking about the thousands of others who had been told, "Not for someone like you." A quiet murmur rose from behind. Na tilted her phone slightly, catching the way Caleb's jaw clenched, but his posture remained calm. She whispered into the mic of her earbuds, "This doesn't look right. I think we're witnessing discrimination on board." And though Caleb didn't know it yet, her whisper would soon be heard by millions. For now, he sat in seat 2B, silent but immovable, while tension wrapped itself around the cabin like a storm cloud refusing to pass. The cabin's hum returned briefly, but the tension hung like a veil that refused to lift. Caleb stayed in seat 2B, his hands resting calmly on the armrests. To the untrained eye, he looked like any business traveler determined to hold his ground. Inside, though, his thoughts churned. He had faced bias in boardrooms and negotiations worth billions and whispered comments after speeches. But there was something raw about being told in front of strangers, "Not for someone like you." Linda Hargrave hovered near the galley, whispering to Shawn Doyle. Her eyes darted toward Caleb every few seconds, as if his mere presence disturbed the balance she thought she commanded. Shawn eventually nodded, squared his shoulders, and stepped closer. Sir Shawn began, voice firm but painted with a false gentleness. "Let's work together here. We can reseat you in business class. It's still comfortable, still premium, and you'll be away from this misunderstanding." Caleb looked at him directly. His voice carried no anger, only clarity. "This is not a misunderstanding. This is my assigned seat." Shawn pressed his lips, glancing at Linda as if seeking backup. Linda added quickly, "We do have distinguished guests boarding. I'm sure you'd understand making room for those who travel with us frequently." It was a careful way of saying you don't belong, wrapped in polite syllables. Passengers nearby shifted in their seats. A man in 1A scrolled his phone faster, pretending not to listen. A woman in 3C glanced at Caleb with something close to sympathy, but looked away as soon as Linda caught her eye. Silence became complicity. Nina Alvarez, sitting just far enough to avoid suspicion, angled her phone lower, capturing both Caleb's calm face and the stiff posture of the crew. She whispered into her mic again. "They're trying to pressure him into moving. He's not budging. This is bigger than a seat." Caleb's chest rose with a slow inhale. He reminded himself that this wasn't just about him. Each word he chose mattered. Each reaction would echo. "I purchased a first-class ticket just like everyone else in this section," Caleb said. "Moving me against my will isn't customer service. It's something else." Shawn's patience thinned. He leaned closer, lowering his tone, but not his volume enough to prevent others from hearing. "Look, sir, don't make this harder than it needs to be. We don't want a scene. People are watching." Caleb's gaze softened, but stayed steady. "A scene was made the moment she told me this seat wasn't for someone like me." His words landed heavy in the space between them. Linda stiffened. Her hand brushed the pearl pin at her collar like a reflex, a gesture of composure masking irritation. She turned toward the galley curtain. "Captain Grant will want to be informed," she muttered. The mention of the captain brought a ripple of unease through the cabin. Pilots rarely interfered with passenger seating unless a serious conflict arose, but Linda's confidence suggested she expected support. Minutes later, the intercom crackled. A calm but authoritative voice filled the cabin. "This is Captain Russell Grant. I've been made aware of a seating issue in first class. I need all parties to cooperate with crew instructions. We cannot delay departure." Sean straightened, emboldened. "You heard the captain," he said softly, as though the words carried finality. Caleb let the message sink in. He could feel 30 pairs of eyes fixed on him, waiting to see if he would yield. He thought of his father again, how he once described being ordered off a bus in 1962. "I stepped down so others wouldn't get hurt," his father had said. But I never forgot the shame of it. That shame was generational. Caleb had carried it for years, silent, unspoken, always buried under his success. And here it was again, knocking at the door. "No," Caleb said finally. The word was gentle yet firm. "I will not move." The murmur spread louder this time. Someone coughed nervously. A businessman cleared his throat as though to signal his disapproval, but still no one intervened on Caleb's behalf. Linda's smile returned brittle and forced. "Then we will need to involve airport management. Perhaps they can clarify things for you." She walked briskly down the aisle, her heels clicking against the carpet. Sean followed, muttering into his radio. Caleb remained seated, his jaw set. Inside, though, a battle waged. Do I escalate this? Do I fight, or do I protect myself by walking away? He imagined headlines, a passenger removed for disruption. He imagined investors, board members, people who looked at him and saw only the trouble, never the truth. But he also imagined his employees, the young black engineers at Helios, who looked up to him as proof they belonged in rooms no one expected them to enter. He imagined his daughter Maya, who once asked him at age 10, "Dad, why do they always stare when you pick me up from ballet?" This wasn't about a seat anymore. It was about showing them and himself that dignity was non-negotiable. The galley curtain snapped open again. Linda reappeared this time with another figure beside her. He was in his late 40s, stocky with a lanyard bouncing against his chest. Martin Cole, the airport's duty manager. His expression was already set weary but defensive, as if he had judged the situation before hearing it. Sir Martin began, "We need you to disembark. We can't keep the plane waiting while this dispute continues. You'll be rebooked on the next flight. Complimentary upgrade." Caleb tilted his head, eyes narrowing slightly. "I don't need a rebooking. I need respect for the seat I rightfully purchased." Martin's gaze hardened. "If you refuse, we'll have to call security, and I'm sure none of us wanted to come to that." The words weren't a warning. They were a threat. For the first time, Caleb felt the heat in his chest, a spark of anger pushing against his composure. He wanted to stand to let them know who he truly was. Not just a passenger, not just another man they thought they could erase. But he held back. Timing mattered. If he revealed himself now, it would feel like revenge, not justice. He stayed seated, staring at Martin in silence. The cabin seemed to lean closer, breaths held waiting. Martin signaled to Sean. "Escort him out. We're not wasting more time." Sean reached down. His hand hovered just above Caleb's shoulder. Not touching yet, but close enough to make the message clear the decision had been made. Caleb rose slowly, deliberately, his body calm, even as his mind thundered. Every eye and first class followed as he gathered his leather bag and stepped into the aisle. The walk felt longer than any he had taken, each footstep carrying generations of insult every second, recorded in silence. As he passed row 3, Naina lowered her phone, her heart pounding. She knew the footage she captured was explosive. But she also knew the look on Caleb's face meant this story wasn't finished. The galley curtain closed behind him, sealing the scene like the end of an act. The cabin exhaled, relieved and uneasy. But for Caleb, the play had only just begun. The jet bridge was colder than the cabin. The blast of conditioned air hummed through the narrow tunnel as Caleb Morgan stepped forward, flanked by Shaw Doyle and Martin Cole. His leather bag weighed heavier now, not because of its contents, but because of what it represented, the quiet dignity he refused to drop, even as they pushed him out. The muffled voices of passengers behind him faded as the cabin door sealed shut. For a moment, it was just the echo of footsteps on the carpeted floor, each one like a drum beat of judgment. Caleb's face remained calm, but inside his mind churned. He replayed his father's stories of being told to step off buses, of being refused service at diners. His father always carried those humiliations like scars, invisible but permanent. Caleb had promised himself he would never live through the same ritual. And yet here he was, walking out of a first-class cabin where his name, his ticket, and his money still weren't enough. At the end of the jet bridge, a small crowd of ground staff waited, uncertain whether to look at him or away. Most chose to look down at their clipboards. No one offered eye contact, let alone solidarity. "Right this way, sir," Martin said, his tone clipped efficient, as though shepherding Caleb like an error that needed correcting. They entered the terminal, where other passengers preparing for boarding glanced curiously. A few recognized the boarding pass still in Caleb's hand and whispered, but nobody stepped forward. Silence was louder than words. Caleb slowed his pace. He could feel Sean at his shoulder, impatient, wanting this over with. Martin gestured toward a holding area near the gate. "You can wait here," Martin said. "We'll arrange for rebooking. It might take a few hours." "I'm not waiting," Caleb replied evenly. His voice was calm, but the steel beneath it was unmistakable. "I had a seat. I still do. What you did was not rebooking. It was removal." Martin frowned, already irritated by Caleb's composure. "Sir, I understand your frustration, but this isn't the place to debate. Security can be here in 2 minutes if necessary." That word, security, stung. It wasn't a service, it was a threat. Caleb saw the pattern so clearly when reason failed. Intimidation followed. He sank into a chair near the window. Outside, the sun was dropping low, scattering streaks of orange across the tarmac. He watched as ground crews loaded luggage onto aircraft, as if the world kept moving while his dignity had been forcibly paused. His phone buzzed. A text from his chief operating officer boss. "Are you okay? Something's blowing up online." Caleb tilted his head, slightly confused. He opened Twitter. His breath caught when he saw a video already racking up thousands of views. Nina Alvarez had uploaded it just minutes earlier. The caption read, "Black man with confirmed first-class ticket forced off flight. Sky-eyed discrimination." The clip was grainy but clear enough. Linda's dismissive tone, Sean's pressure, Martin's threat, Caleb's calm refusal. It was all there. The retweets climbed by the second. Comments flooded in. "Not in 2025. This is shameful. He handled it with more grace than I would have. Reminds me of my father. Nothing ever changes." Caleb scrolled, his chest tightening. A strange mix of humiliation and vindication washed over him. He hadn't chosen this spotlight, yet here it was, forcing the world to see what so many endured in silence. Na herself appeared a moment later, standing hesitantly near the waiting area. She walked over her phone, still warm from recording. "Sir," she said softly, I'm sorry this happened. People need to know. I thought if I didn't post it, it would just disappear." Caleb studied her for a moment. She was young, maybe late 20s, with a restless energy that reminded him of his daughter Maya. He saw both courage and fear in her eyes. The courage to speak up, the fear of whether it was enough. "You did the right thing," Caleb said quietly. "Thank you." Na exhaled, relieved. It's already going viral. News outlets are reaching out. This won't just go away. Caleb gave a faint nod, though his mind was elsewhere. Viral outrage could burn hot, but it could also burn out. What mattered wasn't the flame. It was what it left behind. His phone buzzed again. Another message from the COO board is nervous. Should we activate Phase 1? Caleb stared at the words. Phase 1 wasn't just a protocol. It was a line in the sand. It meant moving from silence to action, from patience to power. He hadn't crossed that line in years. He hesitated. Was this about vengeance, or was it about something bigger? The humiliation was personal, but the fight was collective. He closed his eyes, leaning back in the chair. For a brief moment, he imagined his father again, sitting at that diner counter, told to leave, feeling eyes on his back. What if someone had stood with him then? What if someone had refused to be silent? When Caleb opened his eyes, the decision had already been made. He typed back one word. Na tilted her head, sensing something had shifted in him. "What happens now?" she asked. Caleb looked out at the runway where another aircraft roared into the sky, free and unbound. His voice was soft but firm. "Now," he said, "we stopped letting them decide who belongs behind them." Sean and Martin lingered by the counter, whispering, unaware that their decisions were about to echo far beyond this terminal. For Caleb, Morgan humiliation was no longer the end of the story. It was the beginning of something much larger. By the time Caleb Morgan reached the lounge, the atmosphere in the terminal had shifted. What had started as whispers around Gate C-17 was now a roar across social media feeds. Travelers scrolling through their phones gasped, showing screens to one another. A few even glanced toward Caleb, then quickly looked away, as if they had glimpsed someone larger than life, but didn't yet know how to approach him. Caleb set his leather bag down in the corner of the lounge and sat. His phone vibrated endlessly on the armrest notifications stacking on top of one another. Break and black man forced off first-class seat at Sky High Airways. Video hits 500,000 views in under an hour. Witness says they told him the seat wasn't for someone like you. The hashtags multiplied. Here's a sky-high discrimination. Not for someone like you. Here's seat 2B. Each headline carried the sting of humiliation, but also the spark of something bigger. Collective outrage. Nah. Alvarez appeared again. Phone clutched to her chest, her eyes wide with both fear and excitement. "It's everywhere," she said, sliding into the seat opposite Caleb. "CNN, MSNBC, even local stations are already calling. They want your name, your side." Caleb rubbed the bridge of his nose. He hadn't asked for any of this. He wanted only to get home to prepare for a board meeting the next morning, to maybe call his daughter before she went to bed. Now he was a headline, a trending topic, a symbol. He sipped water slowly. "If I speak now," he murmured, "they'll hear a man defending himself. If I wait, they'll hear something else." "What do you mean?" Na asked. Caleb turned his phone so she could see the text still glowing from his COO Phase 1 activated. Na frowned. "You're someone important, aren't you?" Caleb didn't answer directly. Instead, he leaned back and let the weight of the moment settle. His mind was already 2 steps ahead, mapping outcomes, consequences, strategies. He wasn't just thinking about his dignity anymore. He was thinking about systemic change. Across the lounge, other passengers whispered louder now. One man muttered, "Saw the clip, disgraceful." A woman said, "That could have been my husband." Another added, "It's always the same story, isn't it?" Caleb noticed something new. People weren't just watching him, they were watching each other. The outrage was communal, binding strangers together. His phone rang. He recognized the number, Thomas Ellison, CEO of Sky High Airways. He let it ring twice before answering. Caleb Thomas said, his voice tight, rushed. "I'm sure you've seen the video. We are dealing with it. Let's not escalate further. We can resolve this privately." Caleb's lips curled in a small, humorless smile. Privately, he repeated, "The whole world is watching. Thomas, exactly why we should handle this with care. Thomas replied, "I'll personally authorize compensation upgrades, whatever you need." Caleb's voice was calm but edged with steel. "This isn't about an upgrade. This is about a culture you allowed to fester." Thomas's silence on the other end was telling. He wasn't used to being challenged like this, not by a man he considered an ally in business, let alone by someone he'd underestimated on this scale. Caleb ended the call without another word. Na leaned forward, astonished. "You just hung up on the CEO of Sky High." Caleb finally met her gaze. "I own a quarter of his airline. He should be more careful before assuming silence is my only option." Na blinked. The pieces were falling into place. "You're not just a passenger," she whispered. You're their biggest shareholder." Caleb didn't confirm or deny, but the glint in his eyes told her enough. As the minutes ticked by, the video hit 1 million views. Then 2 civil rights advocates tweeted support. Celebrities added their voices. Politicians chimed in with promises of accountability. Inside the lounge, a television flickered with breaking news. Sky High Airways under fire after viral video of black CEO forced off flight. The cheering at the bottom of the screen ran endlessly. The anchor's voice carried across the quiet room. This isn't the first time airlines have faced accusations of bias. But tonight's video shows an incident already sparking calls for reform. Passengers in the lounge stared at the screen, then at Caleb. Some nodded subtly, as if offering unspoken solidarity. Others looked unsettled, as though realizing they had witnessed a turning point in real time. Caleb's phone buzzed again. This time it was his daughter, Maya. Her voice trembled on the line. "Dad, are you okay? I saw the video. They were so cruel." Caleb closed his eyes briefly. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Don't worry. But everyone's talking about it," she said. "My friends are sending me links. They all know you." Caleb hesitated, then spoke gently. "Sometimes the hardest thing is not what people do to us, but how loudly they pretend not to see. Today, people saw that matters." Maya sniffled but grew quieter. "You always told me dignity is non-negotiable." "That's right," Caleb said softly. "And I'm not moving from that seat, even if I'm not physically there right now." When he hung up, his resolve was sharper. The humiliation still stung, but the outrage it fueled had become something greater than shame. It was a spark. Na checked her phone. "They're calling this the Seat 2B incident," she said. "It's spreading like wildfire. Hashtags, commentary, editorials, it's all moving so fast." Caleb leaned forward, his voice low but certain. "Then let them watch, because this isn't going to end with a headline. It's going to end with accountability." For the first time since stepping off the plane, Caleb allowed himself a small smile. It wasn't joy. It was recognition that the humiliation he carried was no longer his alone. It belonged to everyone who had ever been told, "You don't belong." And now the world was listening. The night deepened outside the airport windows. Flights taxied in and out across the runways, their lights blinking against the darkening Texas sky. Yet in the lounge, the air felt still. Heavy with anticipation, Caleb Morgan sat like a stone in a river, calm on the surface, but carrying unseen currents below. His phone continued to vibrate in sharp bursts. Reporters, allies, investors, strangers all wanted a piece of him now. Na Alvarez was still there, scribbling notes into her worn leather notebook, though her eyes rarely left Caleb. She studied him with the curiosity of a reporter, but the quiet respect of someone realizing she was watching history unfold. "Do you know what people are saying out there?" Na asked cautiously. Caleb gave a faint smile. "That depends which corner of the internet you mean. They're calling you a symbol," Na said. "Some think you're just a random victim. Others think you're someone bigger, someone powerful, but no one seems to know the whole truth." Caleb adjusted his cufflinks. The truth has a way of arriving at its own pace. He thought again of the text from his COO Phase 1 activated. The machinery was already in motion. Calls to board members, emergency memos to Sky High Airways, executives' legal teams pulling documents from their secure servers. He hadn't needed to say much. The system he built around himself was designed for moments like this, when silence would be cowardice and action the only path forward. Another call buzzed through this time from Janet Wu, Sky High's chief financial officer. Caleb answered. Caleb Janet began voice-clipped but urgent. "We're facing a nosedive in stock price. Pre-market futures already reacting. The chairman wants to know if you'll issue a statement to calm investors." Caleb leaned back, his voice even. "A statement that says that I enjoyed being humiliated in front of strangers that will pay a fine and move on. Something measured." Janet pressed. "Something that stops the bleeding." Caleb closed his eyes for a moment. He could see his father's weathered hands fixing an engine, his mother's steady gaze across the dinner table, his daughter's tearful voice earlier that evening. None of them would ask him to issue a measured statement. They would ask him to tell the truth. When he opened his eyes, his tone was calm, but unyielding. "Janet, the bleeding doesn't stop with a press release. It stops when this company admits it has a disease." Before she could answer, Caleb ended the call. He wasn't here to manage Sky High's optics. He was here to change its reality. Nana had heard enough of the call to piece things together. She lowered her pen. "You're not just a passenger," she whispered. "You're one of them, no more than that. You're above them." Caleb met her gaze. He didn't flinch. "I'm their largest shareholder, 28%, enough to shake the ground they're standing on." Na's jaw dropped. "So when you walked off that plane, they didn't just humiliate a customer, they humiliated their own owner." Caleb allowed himself the smallest nod. They thought they were escorting out a man they could dismiss. They were escorting out their future. The words hung in the air, heavy electric. Na scribbled them down furiously, her fingers trembling. She knew this revelation would ignite the story into something unstoppable. Caleb's phone chimed again. This time, it wasn't an executive. It was an old friend, Reverend Samuel Price, a civil rights leader who had marched in protests decades earlier. His message was simple. "History doesn't wait. Stand firm. We're with you." Caleb's chest tightened with emotion. He remembered being a young boy sitting on Samuel's knee, hearing stories of Selma Montgomery, the sacrifices carved into the American conscience. Now it was his turn not to march with signs, but to wield power in boardrooms. Different battlefield, same war. Na leaned forward. "What happens now? It's phase 1. Caleb inhaled slowly, considering his words. "Phase 1 is simple. We demand accountability at the highest level, not apologies, not vouchers change. Will they listen?" she asked. "They'll listen," Caleb replied, his eyes hardening. "When they realize their jobs depend on it." At that very moment, across the city, in a glass tower downtown, the Sky High Airways boardroom glowed with fluorescent light. Executives hunched over their phones, arguing in tense whispers. Stock graphs bled red across giant monitors. A reporter's voice echoed from the wall-mounted TV. "Unconfirmed reports suggest the passenger removed from Sky High Airways Flight 482 is none other than Helios Technologies CEO Caleb Morgan, the airline's largest shareholder." The room fell silent. Thomas Ellison, the CEO, paled. Richard Feldman, the chairman, slammed a hand against the table. "God help us, this isn't just a PR disaster. It's a coup." Back at the airport lounge, Caleb rose slowly, his frame commanding without effort. He turned to Nana, who was still scribbling frantically. "You wanted a story," he said softly. "Now you have one." Na's throat went dry. She felt the weight of it. The kind of story that didn't just make headlines, but shifted the ground beneath an entire industry. Caleb picked up his leather bag, his eyes steady on the darkened runway outside. It's time they learned whose seat this really is. For the first time since being forced off the plane, Caleb Morgan smiled not with arrogance, but with the quiet confidence of a man who knew the storm had finally turned in his favor. The boardroom at Sky High Airways headquarters was a sterile, glass-walled chamber on the 40th floor of a downtown Dallas skyscraper, but that night it felt like a furnace. Tension burned in every corner. Executives' pacing voices clashing the room, echoing with a chaos rarely seen in such polished halls. CEO Thomas Ellison sat rigid at the head of the mahogany table, his usually crisp suit wrinkled by the weight of panic. In front of him, 3 screens showed the same video replaying on loop Caleb Morgan's removal from Seat 2A. The calm dignity in Caleb's voice contrasted with the sneer of Brenda Holloway and the sharp bark of Supervisor Mark Denton was undeniable. The clip had already reached 15 million views across platforms. Hashtags like War Sky High Discrimination and War Seat 2A trended globally. A senator from Georgia had posted, "This is not just a customer service issue. This is a civil rights issue." The White House press secretary had been asked about it in the evening briefing. And now, reporters outside the building were circling like hawks. Richard Feldman, the chairman, leaned forward, veins pulsing at his temple. "Thomas explained to me how in God's name we ended up in this position. Do you have any idea what this means? We threw out our largest shareholder like he was some kind of criminal." Thomas tried to steady his voice. "We didn't know it was Caleb Morgan. To the staff, he was just what Margaret Hale, the board's most senior independent director, cut in sharply. Just a black man who dared to sit in a first class." "You think that excuse will save us?" Janet Wu, the CFO, placed her tablet on the table. Her voice clipped. "Our stock has dropped 17% since the video broke. That's over $4 billion in market value evaporated. If Caleb pulls his stake, we are done. Finished. Investors will flee. Creditors will circle, and regulators will be on us by morning." The room fell silent at the stark math. Finally, Arthur Caney, head of legal, cleared his throat. "We need to consider liability. If Mr. Morgan decides to sue, he won't just sue for personal damages. He'll sue for systemic discrimination, breach of fiduciary duty, reputational harm. This could be the largest civil case in aviation history." The words struck like blows. Thomas felt his chest tighten. For years he had managed crises, delayed flights, labor strikes, safety scares, but this was different. This wasn't a storm they could wait out. It was a reckoning. Richard slammed his palm on the table. "We have one option: immediate accountability. Everyone involved in this fiasco must be terminated by sunrise. Denton, Carter, Holloway, every last one of them." But Sir Thomas interjected. "We should investigate first. We don't even have full reports from the flight crew. Firing them outright." Margaret Hale's glare cut him off. "You're still thinking like this is about protecting employees. This is about survival. Caleb Morgan holds 28% of this company. He doesn't bluff. If he demands blood, you give it, or Sky High Airways ceases to exist." The words settled heavily, undeniable. At that moment, the double doors opened and Victor Lang, head of public relations, rushed in. Sweat beat in his forehead. He carried a folder of printouts, each one a headline from the last hour. "Sky High boots Black CEO from first-class passenger. Turns out to be Airline's largest shareholder, Wall Street reacts. Shares in free fall." Victor's voice cracked. "It's spiraling faster than we can manage. CNN is live outside the building. Caleb Morgan hasn't made a public statement yet, but his silence is fueling speculation. We need to control the narrative." Margaret shook her head. "You can't control a narrative when you've already lost it." Arthur leaned in, his tone grim. "Do you understand what this looks like to regulators? They'll open civil rights investigations, labor audits, maybe even hearings in Congress. And when they do, Caleb Morgan will be the one sitting across from them telling his story," Janet added coldly. "And every American watching will see him as the voice of justice and us as the villains." The truth pierced Thomas deeper than any insult. He rubbed his forehead, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do you expect me to do?" Richard Feldman rose from his chair, towering over the table. "I expect you to call him tonight. Offer whatever he demands. If he wants firings, we fire. If he wants reforms, we reform. If he wants your job, Thomas, you hand it over. The room went deathly still. Thomas felt the floor tilt beneath him. For 30 years he had climbed the corporate ladder, sacrificing holidays, family dinners, even his health to lead sky-high airways. And now, in the span of hours, it could all vanish, not because of an accident or financial collapse, but because a woman's entitlement and a crew's cowardice had exposed the rot in their culture. Margaret's voice softened, almost pitying. This isn't about you, Thomas. It's about whether Sky High has the moral capacity to survive. At that moment, Janet's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, her face draining of color. It's him. Caleb Morgan is requesting a meeting with the board. Tonight he'll be here within the hour. Every head turned toward her. Arthur muttered, God help us. Richard straightened his tie. No, God won't help us. Only Caleb will. For a long moment, Thomas stared at the glowing city skyline outside the window, the hum of Dallas like a heartbeat in the distance. He thought of the hundreds of flights airborne at that very moment, each one bearing the Sky High logo on its wings. He thought of the thousands of employees who had trusted him to lead. He thought of his wife's voice once telling him, Don't ever let ambition turn you blind. And he knew blindness had already set in. The boardroom doors closed again, locking them inside with their fear. In less than 60 minutes, Caleb Morgan would walk through those doors, and nothing, not Sky High Airways, not the industry, not Thomas Ellison's career, would ever be the same. The ride from the airport to Sky High headquarters was quiet, almost eerily so. Caleb Morgan sat in the back of a black sedan, the city lights flashing in rhythmic pulses against the tinted windows. His hands rested calmly on his lap, but his mind was alive with calculations, legal leverage, shareholder authority, public opinion. He wasn't simply walking into a boardroom tonight. He was stepping into a battlefield. The car pulled into the underground garage where 2 security guards awaited him. They nodded almost deferentially and escorted him to a private elevator. Caleb could hear the faint buzz of reporters outside the building shouting his name, their voices echoing down the concrete walls. He didn't turn his head. He didn't need cameras tonight. He needed control. When the elevator doors opened, the tension hit him before he even entered the boardroom. Through the glass walls, he could see executives clustered in uneasy silence. Their faces were pale, their eyes darting nervously toward the door as though awaiting a judge. As Caleb stepped inside, the chatter died instantly, every eye fixed on him. Thomas Ellison, the CEO, stood awkwardly. Caleb, he began, his voice thin. Thank you for coming on such short notice. With Caleb raised a hand stopping him mid-sentence. His voice was calm, measured, but carried the weight of authority. Let's not waste time with pleasantries. Thomas, we have a problem. And it didn't start at gate C-17. It started long before the words landed like a hammer. Silence spread across the table. Richard Feldman, the chairman, cleared his throat. Mr. Morgan, we acknowledge the gravity of what happened. We're prepared to take immediate corrective measures. Caleb's eyes swept the room. Corrective measures, he repeated softly. Do you even understand what you've done? You didn't just humiliate me. You humiliated every customer who's ever been told they don't belong. You exposed a culture you've allowed to rot unchecked. Margaret Hale, her expression somber, leaned forward. He's right. This isn't an isolated incident. We've ignored warning signs for years. Thomas bristled. With respect, Margaret. But Caleb cut in again, his tone sharpening. With respect, Thomas, your leadership created this, and leadership is accountable. A heavy silence filled the air. Janet Wu shifted uneasily. Arthur Kane scribbled notes. Victor Lang tugged at his collar. Finally, Caleb placed his phone on the table and pressed play. The boardroom filled with the unmistakable sound of Brenda Holloway's voice sneering. People like you don't belong in first class. No one spoke. The sound hung in the air like poison. Caleb's gaze moved slowly around the table. This is what the world hears. This is what 15 million people watch tonight. Do you think they'll forget? Do you think they'll forgive Thomas's face turned crimson? We can fire the crew involved, announce a full investigation, offer settlements. Caleb leaned in his eyes, unblinking. No, Thomas. You don't negotiate dignity. You don't offer it like a voucher. You enforce it as law. The words carried a sharp edge that made several board members flinch. Richard Feldman tried to reassert control. What do you want? Caleb let the silence stretch, forcing them to sit in the weight of their own discomfort. Then he spoke clearly, deliberately. First, the immediate termination of every employee directly involved, Brenda Holloway, Mark Denton, and Captain Robert Hayes. Not tomorrow, tonight. Heads turned. Thomas stammered. Captain Hayes, he was in command. Caleb interrupted. Silence in the face of discrimination is complicity. He failed to lead. He's done. Margaret gave a small nod of agreement. Richard remained stone-faced. Second, Caleb continued, a public apology not to me but to every passenger who has ever experienced bias at your gates in your cabins from your crews. Not a crafted PR statement, a full acknowledgement of guilt, and a commitment to reform. Victor Lang shifted nervously. Such language could open us to liability. Silence has already opened you to liability, Caleb snapped. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut like glass. Third, he said, leaning back, structural reform, a bias audit across all hiring, promotion, and customer service systems, a new Office of Equity reporting directly to the board, mandatory Antibius training not as a box to tick, but as a condition of employment. Fail it, you're out. The room buzzed with whispers, but Caleb held up a hand. And finally, accountability at the top. If this board cannot guarantee these measures, I will call an emergency shareholder vote. And Thomas, his gaze locked on the CEO, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. You know I have the votes. Thomas's breath caught. Everyone in the room knew it was true. With 28% ownership, Caleb could rally allies and topple leadership overnight. Margaret broke the silence. He's right. We don't survive without him, and frankly, we don't deserve to. Richard Feldman exhaled heavily, his shoulders slumping. Fine, we'll draft the resolutions. We'll move tonight. But Caleb wasn't finished. His eyes narrowed slightly. Not drafts, not resolutions, actions. Before sunrise. I want every termination confirmed, every announcement prepared, every system ready for audit. If you hesitate, I'll go public tomorrow morning and this company won't see another sunrise. The board members exchanged panicked glances. Arthur Kane muttered, he means it. Thomas finally sank into his chair. Defeated, you'll destroy us, Caleb. Caleb's reply was soft, almost sorrowful. No, Thomas. I'll save you, but not for your sake. For the people who still believe flying should mean dignity, not degradation. He rose slowly, collecting his phone, his leather bag, his dignity restored. The silence he left in his wake was heavier than any shout. As the elevator doors closed behind him, Richard Feldman rubbed his temples. God help us. He just took control of the airline, Margaret corrected him quietly. No, he just gave us a chance to be better. The question is whether we'll take it. In the car ride home, Caleb finally allowed himself a long exhale. He had not sought this fight, but it had found him. And now the world was watching to see if he would finish it. The first call came just after midnight. Brenda Holloway was at home scrolling through a storm of hateful messages that filled her social feeds. At first, she had tried to fight back, leaving comments that twisted the truth, insisting the video was out of context. But the internet had a way of stripping excuses down to their bare bones. When her phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number, she answered hesitantly. M. Holloway. This is Richard Feldman, chairman of Sky High Airways, effective immediately. Your employment is terminated for gross misconduct. Security will collect your badge and uniform tomorrow morning. Brenda's jaw dropped. Wait, you can't just Richard's voice cut like steel. We can and we have. The line went dead. She stared at the phone in disbelief, realizing her 22-year career had evaporated in a matter of seconds. The videos, the hashtags, the headlines, they had crushed her faster than any union grievance ever could. And behind it all, she knew whose hand had guided the blade. Caleb Morgan. Across town, Mark Denton, the cabin supervisor who had ordered Caleb off the plane, was still awake pacing his kitchen. His teenage son sat silently at the table, watching the news play clips of his father's face. The call came for him, too. It was Arthur Caney from Legal. Mark, your actions on Flight 482 violated both company policy and federal law regarding passenger rights. You are hereby terminated, effective immediately. Mark tried to argue, his voice shaking. I was just doing my job. I thought you thought wrong, Arthur replied coldly. You had a chance to lead. You chose complicity, and now you live with the consequences. When the call ended, Mark dropped into a chair, burying his face in his hands. His son's quiet whisper cut deeper than any boardroom decreed. Dad, why didn't you stand up for him? But perhaps the hardest call was the one placed to Captain Robert Hayes. He was on layover in Denver, already preparing for a morning flight to San Francisco. His years of spotless service and decorated military background had made him untouchable, or so he thought. The call came from Margaret Hale herself. Captain Hayes, she began, her tone firm, but not unkind. As captain of Flight 482, you were responsible for the conduct of your crew. You failed to intervene when a passenger's civil rights were violated. Effective immediately, your command has ended. Hayes's voice broke. Margaret, please. You know me. I've flown half my life without a blemish. I froze. I didn't know what to do. You knew, she said quietly. But you chose silence, and silence has consequences. For the first time in years, Robert Hayes felt small, stripped of the authority that had defined him. Alone in his hotel room, he stared at his uniform hanging neatly in the closet. Tomorrow, it would be nothing more than fabric. Back at Sky High headquarters, the boardroom hummed with confirmation messages. Janet Wu checked off each termination as legal notices were sent. Victor Lang prepared the official press release. Sky High Airways announces immediate dismissal of employees involved in Flight 482 incident. We apologize unreservedly to Mr. Caleb Morgan and to all passengers who have faced discrimination. This is the first step in our commitment to systemic reform. The statement was blunt, uncharacteristically so. But it was exactly what Caleb had demanded. While the firings rolled out, Caleb sat in his study at home, the dim glow of a lamp casting shadows on his desk. He wasn't celebrating. He wasn't vindictive. He was simply resolute. Each firing wasn't about punishment. It was about precedent. A message to every employee, every executive, every passenger: dignity is not negotiable. His phone buzzed again. This time it was Reverend Samuel Price. You did it, the old man said, pride in his growly voice. Caleb shook his head. No, Reverend, this is just the start. Firings alone don't heal a culture. They clear the ground. Now we plant something new. On social media, the reactions poured in as the press release hit the wires. Civil rights groups praised the decisive action. Passengers shared stories of their own mistreatment, attaching them to the hashtag Mars Sky High Accountability. Commentators called it the most dramatic corporate reckoning in aviation history. But not everyone was satisfied. Some argued the firings were scapegoats designed to protect the board. Others demanded Thomas Ellison's resignation, and whispers grew louder. Would Caleb Morgan himself step in to lead Sky? Meanwhile, the 3 dismissed employees faced the public's fury. Brenda's neighbors avoided her at the grocery store. Mark received threatening letters. Robert Hayes, once admired, now found himself shunned by colleagues. Each had believed their choices were small in the moment. Now those choices had reshaped their entire lives. In the stillness of his study, Caleb thought of them not with hatred, but with a heavy recognition. They had revealed the cost of silence, of arrogance, of unchecked bias, and while they paid with careers, he carried the burden of ensuring the lesson wasn't lost. The night wore on. By 3:00 a.m., every termination was confirmed, every announcement drafted, every reform framework set in motion. The machinery of justice, once rusted by denial, was grinding into motion. For Caleb, there was no triumph in the firings, only clarity. A seat had been stolen from him. But tonight, he had claimed something greater, the authority to redefine what belonging meant in the skies. The sun rose over Dallas with a kind of uneasy glow, casting streaks of orange across the glass towers downtown. Reporters had camped outside Sky High headquarters overnight, their cameras pointed toward the revolving doors, waiting for any sign of movement. At exactly 8 a.m., the company's press release went live. News anchors interrupted broadcasts, their voices urgent. Breaking news. Sky High Airways has fired 3 employees following last night's viral incident involving shareholder and CEO of Helios Technologies, Caleb Morgan. The airline has issued a public apology, calling the incident a violation of dignity and a betrayal of trust. The words rippled across the country. Airports replayed the headlines on their screens. Commuters read them on their phones. Ordinary people who had never heard of Caleb Morgan now spoke his name at kitchen tables, in office elevators, at bus stops inside his home. Caleb sat at the breakfast table with his daughter, Maya. She clutched her cereal spoon but wasn't eating. Her eyes darted nervously between her father and the TV across the room. "They keep showing it," she said softly. The video over and over. Caleb reached across the table and gently squeezed her hand. "I know, and it's not easy to see, but sometimes the truth has to be shown until people can't look away anymore." Maya blinked back tears. "Do you think they hate you?" Caleb's eyes softened. "Some might, but more people are seeing what we've carried in silence. That matters." On the other side of town, Sky High executives shuffled into a hastily arranged press conference. Richard Feldman stood at the podium, flanked by Thomas Ellison and Margaret Hale. The room buzzed with reporters shouting questions, their voices clashing. "Mr. Feldman, why did it take a viral video to act? Is Thomas Ellison going to resign? Will Mr. Morgan take control of the airline?" Richard raised a hand, his voice steady but weary. "Sky High Airways failed one of its most important passengers last night. We failed a leader, a shareholder, and most importantly, a man who deserved respect. We accept full responsibility. Immediate actions have been taken and further reforms will follow." Margaret stepped forward, her tone firmer. "This company has a disease and denial is no longer an option. We will open our books to independent auditors, create an Office of Equity, and implement mandatory Antibius training. This isn't about protecting our image. It's about rebuilding trust." The room erupted with questions, but the one name on every journalist's lips was Caleb Morgan. Where was he? What would he say? They didn't have to wait long. By noon, Caleb appeared not at Sky High headquarters, but at a community center in South Dallas, a modest brick building with folding chairs set up for a hastily called town hall. The room was filled not with executives or shareholders, but with everyday people. Teachers, flight attendants, bus drivers, students' cameras lined the back wall, broadcasting live. "Nah." Alvarez stood near the front, notebook in hand, her eyes locked on Caleb as he took the stage. He didn't wear a suit today, just a simple navy sweater and slacks. No power tie, no boardroom armor. He looked like one of them, not above them. The room hushed. "I didn't plan to speak today." Caleb began, his voice low but carrying. "But last night the world saw something that happens far too often in silence. A man was told he didn't belong. A seat was taken from him not because of money, not because of merit, but because of the color of his skin." He paused, letting the words sink in. "That man was me, but I'm not the only one. Every day someone is told in ways big and small that they don't belong. In classrooms, in offices, in neighborhoods, and yes, in airplanes. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Caleb's voice grew stronger. What happened to me isn't about a seat. It's about dignity, and dignity is non-negotiable. Sky High Airways has fired those directly involved. But let's be clear, this isn't just about a few employees. It's about a system that allows bias to breathe unchecked. That ends now. Applause broke out, rising like a wave. Some in the audience stood clapping with tears in their eyes. Na scribbled furiously, her heart pounding. She knew she wasn't just recording words. She was witnessing the start of something bigger than a press cycle. Reporters called out questions, but Caleb didn't stay long. He shook hands, hugged a grandmother who whispered, "I've been waiting my whole life to hear someone say that," and then slipped quietly out the back door. By evening, his words had been replayed across every major network. Commentators debated whether Caleb would assume control of the airline. Some praised him as a hero. Others accused him of orchestrating a corporate coup. But among ordinary people, the reaction was clear. They saw themselves in his story. A man who had worked his way to power, yet still faced the same humiliation that countless others endured daily. In living rooms and diner booths, people repeated his words, "Dign is non-negotiable." At Sky High headquarters, Thomas Ellison sat alone in his office, staring at the statement playing on TV. He looked tired, beaten. A man watching the empire he once commanded slip through his fingers. For the first time, he wondered if tomorrow's shareholder vote would even include his name. Meanwhile, Caleb returned home to Maya, who had finally found her smile again. She curled against him on the couch, whispering, "I'm proud of you, Dad." He kissed her forehead gently. "I didn't do this just for me. I did it for everyone who deserves to stay in their seat." Outside, the city buzzed with the hum of headlines, hashtags, and hope. The reckoning had begun, and the world was waiting to see how far Caleb Morgan would carry it. The following week unfolded like a whirlwind. What had begun as a single confrontation on a plane was now shaping the future of an entire airline. Sky High Airways was under more scrutiny than at any other point in its history. Customers threatened boycotts, investors demanded stability, and regulators signaled interest in hearings. Inside the headquarters, the board gathered again. This time the atmosphere was not frantic, but sober, as though everyone understood they stood on the edge of transformation or collapse. Caleb Morgan sat at the head of the table not as a guest, but as a force the room now revolved around. Margaret Hale opened the session. "We've fired those responsible. We've apologized, but Caleb is right. This isn't enough. Cosmetic fixes won't survive the storm." Janet Wu adjusted her glasses. "Stock continues to bleed. We can't afford half measures. Investors want proof this company is safe. The only safety now is reform." Caleb's voice was calm. "Steady. Then let's define reform." He pulled a folder from his leather bag and slid it across the table. Printed on the front were 3 words: Equity Flight Initiative. Inside is a blueprint, Caleb explained. It's not a suggestion. It's a framework for survival. The board members leaned forward, flipping through the pages. The initiative was sweeping. Independent bias audit. Every department from hiring to customer service examined by outside experts. Office of Equity. A new division reporting directly to the board with the power to investigate complaints and enforce policy. Mandatory training. Every employee, from pilots to gate agents, required to complete intensive anti-bias and customer dignity programs. Passenger advocate role on every major flight. A trained officer whose sole duty was ensuring fair treatment of passengers. Transparency reports. Quarterly data published publicly. Detail in complaints, resolutions, and progress. Arthur Kane looked up, eyebrows raised. This goes beyond industry standard. It reroutes it. Caleb met his gaze. That's the point. We don't just patch holes in a sinking ship. We rebuild the hull. Richard Feldman rubbed his temples. Do you realize how disruptive this will be? Unions will push back. Managers will revolt. Costs will skyrocket. Margaret cut them off, and if we don't, we collapse. The market has spoken. Janet nodded firmly. Our investors will back reform if it saves their capital. This plan is radical, but survival always is. Thomas Ellison, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke. His voice was thin, almost hollow. And what happens to me in this brave new sky high? Caleb regarded him for a long moment. That depends on you, Thomas. You can fight change and be swept aside, or you can admit failure and step down with dignity. The words stung, but Thomas didn't argue. He looked around the table and saw no allies left. His time was over. The board voted unanimously to adopt the Equity Flight Initiative. It was a moment both monumental and surreal. An airline publicly committing not only to address bias, but to enshrine dignity as a corporate mandate. News of the reforms spread quickly. Headlines called it a revolution in the skies. Civil rights groups praised the boldness. Other airlines watched uneasily, fearing the pressure to follow. But reforms weren't just lines on paper. They were lived experiences. And the first test came sooner than expected. 2 days later, at Dallas-Fort Worth Airport, a passenger loudly complained when a black mother and her toddler were seated beside him in business class. In the past, a flight attendant might have offered to resolve the situation by moving the mother to a less visible seat. This time, the passenger advocate, a young woman named Claire, stepped forward, calmly. Firmly, she told the complainant passenger, "Sir, the only seat that will change is yours. We don't move people out of their rightful place." The passenger grumbled but moved. The cabin erupted in quiet applause. Word spread quickly online. Sky High really changed. At home that night, Caleb saw the clip and smiled faintly. Change was never instant, but symbols mattered, and this one showed progress. Still, he knew the battle wasn't won. Reform was fragile. Cynics doubted the company's sincerity. Some employees resented the mandatory training, but every system shift came with resistance. Caleb gathered his leadership team at Helios Technologies and spoke plainly. "We don't let momentum slip. This isn't just about Sky High. This is about setting a new standard for corporate accountability. If we succeed, it ripples across industries." Reverend Samuel Price joined them, leaning on his cane, his voice a reminder of battles fought long before. The fight for dignity doesn't end with a signature. It's tested in silence in small moments when no one is watching. That's where culture is reborn. Maya listened from the side, her young eyes bright with a mix of worry and pride. "Does this mean no one will ever hurt people like that again, Dad?" Caleb knelt beside her, speaking gently. "It means fewer people will get away with it, and more will find the courage to speak up when they see it." The following week, Sky High's first transparency report went live. It revealed 143 complaints of bias over the past year. Numbers the airline had never publicly admitted before. But instead of shame, the openness generated respect. Customers began posting messages of support thanking the company for finally telling the truth. For the first time in weeks, Sky High stock ticked upward. Investors saw not weakness, but resilience. At the community level, something deeper stirred. Churches, schools, and advocacy groups began citing Caleb's phrase, "Dignity is non-negotiable." The words appeared on protest signs in classrooms, even spray-painted on alley walls. Caleb hadn't asked for the role of symbol, but he had accepted the responsibility, and now he could see it growing beyond him into a movement. One evening, sitting on the porch with Samuel, Caleb reflected aloud. "I never wanted to lead an airline, but maybe the point was never the airline. Maybe the point was proven that even in boardrooms, dignity can be law." Samuel chuckled softly. "You've always had a way of turning battles into blueprints." Caleb looked out at the fading sunset, his hand resting on Maya's shoulder. "Blueprints are only the beginning. The real work is building, and somewhere thousands of feet above a sky-high plane carried passengers across the night sky." each one a quiet beneficiary of a man who refused to move from his rightful seat. The reforms rolled out quickly, and for a moment it seemed as though Sky High Airways had turned a corner. Headlines hailed the Equity Flight Initiative as historic. Customers tweeted support. Advocacy groups praised the transparency reports. But as with any shift that cut deep, backlash soon followed. It started online. Anonymous employees posted on forums complaining about the mandatory training, mocking the new passenger advocate role as babysitting for grown-ups. A pilots' union representative gave a fiery interview on a conservative news channel calling the initiative corporate overreach and accusing Caleb Morgan of playing politics with aviation. "This isn't about dignity," the representative growled into the camera. "This is about power, and Morgan is consolidating it at the expense of our crews." The clip went viral in its own circle, fueling resentment. Overnight, Caleb became both a symbol of justice and a target for those threatened by change. At Sky High headquarters, Thomas Ellison, though stripped of influence, fanned the flames quietly. He leaked documents to sympathetic journalists suggesting the reforms would bankrupt the company. "Morgan is destabilizing an industry giant," one op-ed read, for the sake of personal crusades. Inside the boardroom, tension rose again. Richard Feldman worried about investor backlash. Janet Wu presented spreadsheets showing reform costs climbing into the tens of millions. Even Margaret Hale, Caleb's staunchest ally, admitted the resistance could fracture the workforce. One evening, Caleb sat alone in his study, the glow of his desk lamp casting tired shadows. He scrolled through messages, threats, insults, accusations, but among them were also notes of gratitude. "I was upgraded to business class for the first time, and no one questioned if I belonged. My son wears your quote on a shirt to school. Dignity is non-negotiable. Thank you for not backing down." He paused on one message from a flight attendant named Jasmine, who had quietly supported him that night at gate C-17. "I'm still here, Mr. Morgan. I see the changes. Some of us believe in them. Don't stop." The words grounded him. He realized reform wasn't measured by critics shouting the loudest, but by the quiet courage of those willing to embrace it. Still, he couldn't ignore the storm. So he called a meeting not in the boardroom, but at the hangar floor where mechanics, flight attendants, gate agents, and baggage handlers gathered. Over 200 employees stood among the smell of jet fuel and the clatter of tools, uncertain why their largest shareholder was addressing them directly. Caleb stepped onto a small platform, his voice carrying across the cavernous space. "I know change isn't easy," he began. "I know some of you think these reforms are punishment, that I'm here to tear down what you've built. But listen carefully. This isn't about tearing down. It's about building something stronger." He paused, scanning the crowd. Some arms were crossed, eyes skeptical, others leaned forward, curious. "When I was forced off that plane, I wasn't just humiliated as a man. I was humiliated as a passenger who trusted this airline. And if I could be treated that way, someone with power, with privilege, what does that mean for the people with none, for the mother traveling alone, for the child flying unaccompanied, for the elderly man who can't raise his voice?" The room quieted. Caleb's tone deepened. "This initiative isn't about politics. It's about protection. Protection for you as employees, so you aren't left to handle situations without tools or training. Protection for passengers, so they know their dignity comes first. And protection for this company, so it can stand as a leader, not a cautionary tale." A murmur rippled through the crowd. A mechanic nodded slowly. A flight attendant whispered, "He's right." Caleb leaned closer to the microphone. "I won't lie to you. The cost is high. The resistance is real, but the cost of silence is higher. And I promise you this. If we do this together, Sky High won't just survive. It will set the standard for what aviation can be." Applause broke out, tentative at first, then swelling. Employees clapped. Some even cheered. Not everyone was convinced, but enough were. Caleb could see it, the tide shifting, however slowly. Later that night, Margaret Hale called him. That was the smartest move you could have made. Not the boardroom, not the cameras, the hangar. You spoke to the people who make this airline run. That's leadership. But the backlash wasn't over. The next morning, a headline splashed across a major paper: "Whistleblowers claim sky-high reforms unsustainable." It quoted anonymous sources, likely Thomas Ellison's allies, predicting bankruptcy within a year. The article questioned Caleb's motives, painting him as a power-hungry executive leveraging outrage for control. Caleb read it over coffee. Maya walked in sleepy-eyed, clutching her teddy bear. She looked at the paper and frowned. "Why are they saying bad things about you?" Caleb set the paper aside and pulled her into his lap. "Because change makes people uncomfortable, sweetheart, and when people are uncomfortable, they sometimes fight back." "Does that mean you'll stop?" she asked. He kissed her forehead. "No, it means we're getting somewhere." By the end of the week, protests had formed outside Sky High's headquarters. Some demanding stronger reforms, others demanding Caleb's removal. The sidewalks filled with signs: "Justice" at 30,000 to FT on one side, "Save our jobs" on the other. Caleb stood at his office window, watching the divided crowd. His reflection stared back at him, weary but unbroken. He knew the next steps would define not just his legacy, but the future of everyone who dared to believe dignity could become policy. He whispered to himself the same words he'd spoken to his daughter. Dignity is non-negotiable. And then he turned back to his desk, ready for the next fight. The storm outside Sky High Airways didn't quiet overnight. The protests, the backlash, the praise, the lawsuits had all swirled together into something that could have broken a weaker man. But Caleb Morgan wasn't interested in survival alone. He was interested in transformation. 2 weeks after the hangar speech, Sky High held its most important press conference in decades. The event was staged at Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport in Atlanta, the very place where Caleb had been humiliated on Flight 451. Rows of cameras lined the concourse. Reporters jostled for position. Protesters stood outside with signs both for and against him. Inside, Caleb walked to the podium, flanked by Margaret Hale and Sophia Torres. His voice carried the same calm strength that had defined him since the beginning. "Not long ago, I was told I didn't belong in a seat I had paid for." He began. "I was told to move because of who I am not, because of what I did. That day I was humiliated, but not broken. And today I stand here not to relive the pain, but to honor the progress born from it." He unveiled the official launch of the Equity Flight Initiative, complete with a $0 million compensation fund for passengers who had experienced discrimination in air travel, independent oversight by civil rights organizations, and the new Passenger Advocate Division reporting directly to the board. "This is not just a policy," Caleb declared. "This is a promise that dignity will never again be optional in the skies." The applause was thunderous, but not universal. Some reporters peppered him with sharp questions about costs, sustainability, and backlash from staff. Caleb answered steadily, "Justice is not cheap. Fairness is not convenient, but neither is rebuilding trust once it's been lost. We are not choosing between survival and justice. We are proving that the two must walk together." As the cameras flashed, Sophia whispered, "You just turned the page of history." But the true test came behind closed doors. At the board meeting later that week, Richard Feldman voiced the lingering fear. "We've spent more in 3 months than we projected for 2 years. Investors are jittery. Can you really guarantee this won't sink us?" Caleb met his gaze without flinching. "No system worth keeping collapses because of fairness. If our investors can't stomach justice, they're free to walk. But I promise you this: millions of passengers are choosing us because of who we are becoming. That's the future worth betting on." Margaret Hale leaned forward. The numbers support him. Bookings are rebounding. Customer satisfaction is climbing. And for the first time in years, Sky High is in the news for leadership, not scandal. Richard fell silent. The vote was taken. The reform stood. Months passed, slowly. The noise faded into something steadier, something that looked like progress. At terminals across the country, travelers saw posters reading dignity in action. Employees wore new badges with the words, "Every passenger, every time." Passenger advocates became a familiar presence, resolving conflicts before they escalated. The atmosphere shifted. It wasn't perfect, but it was different. Noticeably so. For Caleb, the most powerful moments came quietly. A mother approached him in Dallas with tears in her eyes. My teenage son was flying alone. For the first time, he told me he felt safe. He said, "Mom, they treated me like I mattered. Thank you." A retired pilot shook his hand in Denver. "I didn't believe in what you were doing at first, but I watched it work. You made me proud of this company again." Even Emily Davis, the flight attendant who had first asked him to move, found a place in the Second Chance program. Months later, she stood on stage at a training seminar, her voice trembling but steady. "I failed that day. I compromised my values. But because of this program, I learned that redemption is possible when accountability is real. Don't make my mistake. Choose integrity first." The crowd gave her a standing ovation. Victor Grant, once defiant, now toured training sessions as a cautionary voice. "I let bias and arrogance destroy my career," he admitted. "Don't let it destroy yours." His raw honesty stunned employees into silence before sparking conversations that might never have happened otherwise. Caleb often thought about the irony. The very people who had once stood against him were now helping lead the charge for reform. That was the power of transformation. Not a race in the past, but using it as a teacher. 6 months later, Congress invited Caleb to testify at a special hearing on bias in transportation. The chamber was packed. Cameras broadcast live. Senators leaned forward, pens poised. Caleb's voice was steady as always. The skies belong to everyone. No ticket should be questioned because of a face. No seat should be denied because of a name. And no child should learn from their first flight that dignity is negotiable. We've shown change is possible. Now it's time to make it permanent. His testimony helped shape the Air Passenger Dignity Act, legislation that mandated amphibious protocols across all U.S. airlines. The ripple of one stolen seat now touched an entire nation. But for Caleb, the most personal victory came far from cameras and headlines. On the anniversary of Flight 451, he visited his father's grave in Atlanta. The autumn air was crisp, the leaves crackling under his shoes. He placed a bouquet of white lies on the headstone and knelt, his voice quiet but firm. "Dad, they tried to take my seat, but they couldn't take my dignity. And because of you, millions more will never have to lose theirs. This fight is bigger than me. It's for every worker you stood beside. Every voice that was silenced, every traveler told they didn't belong. I carried your lesson with me. And now the world does too." He stood in silence, the wind brushing against his coat. For a moment, he felt his father's presence steady, proud, unbroken. Later that evening, Caleb returned home to Maya, who ran to him with her arms wide. "Daddy, did you finish fixing the airplanes?" she asked. He laughed softly, lifting her high into the air. "Not just the airplanes, sweetheart. We're fixing the skies." As she giggled in his arms. Caleb realized the truth. Justice was not about revenge. Redemption was not about forgetting. And dignity was not a luxury. It was the foundation of everything worth building. Sky High Airways had become more than an airline. It had become a symbol, a case study, a movement. And at the center of it all stood Caleb Morgan, the man who had once been told to give up his seat and who instead gave the world a new standard to rise to. The story of Caleb Morgan reminds us that dignity is not a privilege. It is a birthright. Too often people are judged not by their actions or character, but by assumptions tied to race, class, or status. Caleb's journey teaches us that injustice does not always arrive with violence. Sometimes it comes quietly in the form of exclusion, dismissal, or humiliation. For older generations, many of whom have lived through moments of being told where they could or could not sit shop or learn, this story echoes with painful familiarity. But it also carries hope. Caleb did not respond with rage. He responded with resolve. He turned personal pain into collective progress, showing that change is possible when we refuse to accept indignity as normal. In our own lives, we may not face a first-class cabin, but we all encounter moments when we must decide, do we stay silent or do we stand up? Caleb's example invites us to choose courage, because when we do, we don't just protect ourselves, we create a safer, fairer world for those who come after us. Thank you so much for spending your time with this story. If it moved you, if it made you think, or if it reminded you of something deep inside, please support us by liking this video, sharing it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribing to our channel. Together we can keep telling stories that matter, stories that honor dignity, justice, and